The Fenian Raids were a series of small-scale attacks from the United States into Canada from 1866 till 1871, undertaken by Irish Republicans that hoped to force Britain out of their Irish homeland by threatening their Canadian territories. Although adequately trained, many of the raiders were veteran soldiers and armed. All the raids were doomed to fail from being badly organised, poorly led, and lacking in both numbers and supplies. The first two planned raids in 1866 didn't even make it into Canada. The first ended in Vermont, and the second, led by John O'Mahony, got as far as the border. But on the 17th of April 1866, Sir Charles Hastings Doyle left Halifax with Royal Navy warships carrying over 700 British regulars and proceeded to Passamaquoddy Bay, where the Fenian force was concentrated. This show of might by the British discouraged the Fenians, and they dispersed. Undeterred by these setbacks, a further raid was planned for June 1866, this time under the leadership of William R. Roberts, a future Democrat in the American House of Representatives. The attack, planned by General T.W. Sweeney, a distinguished former Union Army officer, called for multiple invasions at points in Canada West and Canada East, intending to cut them off from each other and possible British reinforcements. About 1,300 Fenians crossed the Niagara River into Canada West in the early hours of the 1st of June under Colonel John O'Neill. Sabotaged by Fenians amongst its crew, the U.S. Navy's gunboat, USS Michigan, did not begin intercepting Fenian reinforcements until 14 hours after the advance party had crossed the river ahead of O'Neill's main force. But once the Michigan was deployed, O'Neill's force in the Niagara region was cut off from further supplies and reinforcements. Advancing west into Canada, the Fenians were met at Ridgeway by the Canadian militia under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Alfred Booker. They were inexperienced volunteers with no more than basic drill training. The Fenians were mostly battle-hardened American Civil War veterans. The opposing forces exchanged volleys for about 2 hours before a series of command errors threw the Canadians into confusion. The Fenians took advantage of it by launching a bayonet charge that broke the inexperienced Canadian ranks. The battle claimed 28 Canadian lives with a further 65 wounded, the Fenians 10 killed and 16 wounded. After the battle, the Fenians rested briefly at Ridgeway before returning to Fort Erie. After considering the inability of reinforcements to cross the river and the approach of large numbers of both Canadian militia and British regulars, the remaining Fenians returned to U.S. territory early in the morning of June the 3rd. After the invasion of Canada West failed, the Fenians decided to concentrate their efforts in Canada East. Under General Samuel Spear, 1,000 Fenians marched into Canadian territory, achieving occupancy of Pigeon Hill, Fredericksburg, Saint-Amand, and Stanbridge. Up to this point, the Canadian government had done little to defend the border, but on June the 8th, Canadian forces arrived at Pigeon Hill, and the Fenians, who were low on arms, ammunition, and supplies, promptly surrendered, ending the raid on Canada East. Following these early raids, then U.S. President Andrew Johnson issued a proclamation requiring enforcement of America's neutrality laws, guaranteeing the Fenian invasion could not continue. Generals Ulysses S. Grant and General George Meade went to Buffalo, New York, to inspect the situation. Grant issued strict orders to prevent anyone from violating the border, and the U.S. Army was then instructed to seize all Fenian weapons and ammunition and prevent any more border crossings. The situation seemed to settle down, but 4 years later, in 1870, John O'Neill tried a second time, and on May 25, 1870, he led 200 followers over the border from Franklin, Vermont to Eccles Hill in Canada. A force of Canadian armed citizens awaited the Fenians at the summit. The Canadians opened fire when they reached the border, resulting in the death of a Fenian soldier. This halted the advance of the Fenians, who took cover and returned fire. Lieutenant Colonel William Osborne Smith hurried to the field with a force of militia volunteers. Together with the armed citizens, the Canadian militia charged the Fenian positions. The Fenians retreated, leaving behind their artillery and 2 dead men. The Canadians suffered a number of casualties during the engagement, but none were fatal. 2 days later, the Fenians crossed the border into Quebec. They were headed to Trout River, west of Eccles Hill. The 50th Canadian Battalion and the Montreal Volunteer Artillery and the British 69th Regiment swiftly dealt with this invasion, and the Fenians fled back across the border. After this last inept raid, support for the Fenian Brotherhood's invasion of Canada disappeared, and there was no real threat after the 1890s. Nevertheless, the raids had an important effect on all Canadians. Although they did nothing to advance the cause of Irish independence, the Fenian Raids and the inept efforts of the Canadian militia to repulse them helped to galvanise support for the Confederation of Canada in 1867. Some historians have argued that the affair tipped the final votes of the three colonies of Canada, Nova Scotia and New Brunswick in favour of the collective security of nationhood, making Ridgeway the battle that made Canada. While the Fenians were playing soldiers in their inept and unsuccessful raids, a little west something of greater significance was playing out. With the formation of the new Canadian Confederation in 1867, the new federal government purchased an area then known as Rupert's Land from the Hudson's Bay Company in 1869. They appointed an English-speaking governor, William McDougall. He was opposed by the French-speaking, mostly Métis inhabitants of the settlement, with McDougall wanting to take up his post in the region and survey the area for new townships. He was prevented from entering the territory. Meanwhile, the Métis created a provisional government under Louis Riel to negotiate directly with the Canadian government to establish Manitoba as a Canadian province. While these negotiations were underway, Riel's men arrested members of a pro-Canadian faction who had resisted the provisional government. They included an Orangeman, Thomas Scott. While in jail, Scott became a nuisance as he caused trouble with the guards and made escape attempts. He was then brought in front of a court where they found him guilty of defying the authority of the provisional government, fighting with the guards, and slandering the name of Louis Riel. After a farce of a trial, Riel's government executed Scott for insubordination. The botched execution was conducted under circumstances that rendered it not much more than butchery. After being shot and wounded 3 times, Scott was placed in a coffin and left to die, taking several hours to do so. Canada and the provisional government soon negotiated an agreement, and in 1870 the Parliament of Canada passed the Manitoba Act, allowing the Red River Colony to enter the Confederation as the province of Manitoba. After reaching an agreement, Canada sent a military expedition to Manitoba to enforce its federal authority. Now known as the Woolsey Expedition, or the Red River Expedition, it consisted of Canadian militia and British regular soldiers, led by Colonel Garnet Woolsey. Outrage grew in Ontario over Scott's execution, and many there wanted Woolsey's expedition to arrest Riel for murder and to suppress what they considered to be a rebellion. Warned by many that the soldiers would do him harm and denied amnesty for his political leadership of the rebellion, Riel fled to the United States, and, while the arrival of the troops marked the end of the incident, it's not the last we will hear of Louis Riel. Despite the relative lack of actual combat and casualties, and a full 30 years after the Fenian Raids, the Canadian government requested of the British Crown permission to award a medal to all militia and regular troops that had taken part in the events. Army Order No. 7 of the 7th of January 1899 granted this request, and eligible veterans were invited to apply for the award. It is said that the medal was looked down upon by veterans from real wars, such as those that had fought in the Crimea, and many of them refused to apply for it. Nevertheless, by the end of the application period, which expired in 1929, approximately 17,600 medals were eventually awarded, the vast majority to members of the Canadian militia. The obverse of the Canadian General Service Medal features a profile of Queen Victoria, but, reflecting the lapse in time between events and issue, a much older Queen Victoria than might be expected on a medal for service in 1870. This design, used only twice on campaign medals, was created by sculptor and medalist Sir Thomas Brock, and has the crowned bust of Queen Victoria, facing left, wearing a veil over the back of her crown. Around her neck is a pearl necklace and a pendant. On her left lapel is the ribbon and the Star of the Garter. Surrounding her is the Latin legend Victoria Regina et Imperatrix, which translates to Victoria, Queen and Empress. The reverse depicts the 19th century flag of Canada, surrounded by a wreath of maple leaves and the word Canada above. The medal disc, made of fine silver, is 36 mm in diameter and suspended from its ribbon by a silver straight bar swivelling suspender. The ribbon, which is 32 mm wide, is 3 equal stripes of red, white and red. 3 clasps were authorised, and the medal was never issued without at least one. The clasps are self-explanatory. The first, for Fenian Raids 1866, was awarded to all personnel involved in the repelling of the early raids in 1866. Nearly 12,000 of these clasps were awarded, including about 300 to the Royal Navy. The second clasp is for Fenian Raids 1870 and was awarded to all those who served against the Fenians in the later raids. Approximately 5,500 of these clasps were eventually issued. The final clasp issued for the Canada General Service Medal was that for Red River 1870, for services relating to the suppression of the Red River Rebellion. By far the majority of this clasp was for members of the Woolsey Expedition. The medals were named to the recipients around the rim, but, reflecting the long period for which the award could be claimed, there are a variety of naming styles to be found, with both indented and engraved methods used. That said, medals to the regular British regiments are usually found with impressed capital letters, while Canadian militia are usually impressed with upper and lowercase Roman letters, such as this example to Sergeant J. A. Saunders of the 44th Battalion. Thank you for watching, and join us again next time when we stay in Canada and see what happened to the elusive Louis Riel.